On behalf of the Human Rights Program, my name's Alex Whiting. I'm a professor here, and it's my pleasure to introduce Alexis Demirdjian. I'm going to do a quick introduction and get out of the way because he's the main feature here. Alex is a former colleague of mine. He's a Canadian lawyer, and since 2002, I believe, right? You've been in The Hague,
exactly.
Working at international criminal tribunals. First at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, right? That's where you started, and we actually started at the same time there. I didn't realize that, but I knew we were there at the same time. And now he's a trial attorney at the International Criminal Court. He is in the middle of trial at the International Criminal Court, had to tear himself away. I guess they have a week-long break in the Bagbo trial. And it's great for us because he can be here to present the book that he edited called The Armenian Genocide Legacy. So he's going to talk about the book, in particular focusing on some of the questions of law and this topic. And he promises to leave some time at the end for some questions. So be ready with your questions, and we'll then open it up. So with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I'll stand up for my presentation. I have a hard time sitting and talking at the same time. I hope that's okay with everyone. First of all, Alex, thank you very much for hosting this book launch. I'm really happy to be here, not only because I get to talk about the book, but I also look forward to exchanging with you, and I hope that some of the items I present this morning provokes some discussion. First of all, I'd like to talk to you about the themes and the inspirations behind the book, and then I'll talk about the content. Before I begin, of course, I have to say that although I work at the International Criminal Court, whatever I say today are my views and only mine, and do not represent those of the institution. Can you hear me well? Yeah? Yeah? Can you all hear me? Yeah? All right. If I need to speak louder, just let me know, and I'll increase the volume. So let me start with the book very briefly. This is a book which deals with the Armenian Genocide, which took place in 1915. So again, I'm very grateful for you to be here with these, because these are events which took place 100 years ago. But this is precisely the reason why this book was prepared, to show us what lessons we can learn and what are the effects and the consequences of a genocide and acts of atrocity, and how much of that is left 100 years later, and why is this issue still relevant today, and why do we talk about it? So first, let me talk to you about my environment. You may be familiar with it, The Hague, the city of international justice. The reason why I start there is that that was really the starting point for me. When I arrived in The Hague in 2002, I started to work for the defense initially for 3 years as a legal assistant, and later on I joined the Office of the Prosecutor, and I've worked on several trials there. And it is this environment which kind of inspired me to work on the Armenian Genocide. Although I'm originally Armenian, I had never worked on the issue. I had heard about it, I had read about it, it was interesting. For a period of time, I thought, okay, this is the past. There's an issue of denial out there. But by the time I got to The Hague and started working on trials, and I reviewed evidence, met witnesses, I realized that there were some parallels that we were able to draw between the Armenian Genocide and other conflicts. And that's where the idea emerged of conducting a study of the parallels that could be drawn between these conflicts. Initially, the idea was to conduct a legal study, but as we were approaching the centennial, and as I was starting to have exchanges with scholars in the other fields of study, such as history, sociology, anthropology, I realized that the question of the Armenian Genocide is not limited to legal matters. And then I expanded the whole project to integrate it as an interdisciplinary project. So first, I'd like to show you a document, because that's what we do as lawyers. We review documents, and we're inspired by what we find. This is a document that I had found as I was working on one of the last trials I was on at the ICTY. And I came across this law called the Decree on Temporary Protection of Abandoned Property. This was adopted by one of the Serbian regions in Croatia. And this is a piece of evidence which was tendered in the Milosevic trial. And what I found out by first having seen that law and then having heard evidence from witnesses was this was a euphemism. The property were never really abandoned. They were left behind by people who were expelled, primarily Croatian nationals who had been expelled from the region. And it reminded me of another law which was adopted in May of 1915, so about 75 years earlier, which was adopted by the Ottoman Empire during the deportation of Armenians from what is now modern-day Turkey, and the same process was conducted. Property was abandoned, so-called abandoned. Liquidation commissions were established under pretense of a legal text, and the population which was expelled was effectively dispossessed, and their property was sold over to whoever was going to buy it. So these two parallels, that was the starting point for me saying, okay, there's something that's worth exploring here. So what was also important to me is the following. Of course, what inspires you to write a book on the Armenian Genocide when you're a lawyer working at the international level? Where we work, of course, what we try to do, one of the principles is to individualize criminal responsibility and try to move away from ascribing guilt to an entire nation, right? That's what's really important when you're dealing with individual criminal responsibility. And of course, having heard about the genocide, I knew that there was a risk of an us versus them type of scenario. And that's how it is, unfortunately, in popular belief and in popular thinking. And I wanted to make sure that whatever we were going to write in this book was nonpartisan, that it met the higher standards of academic research, and that we were able to get to the bottom of facts and focusing on the facts. Actually, one of the first things that I really didn't want was to have the word genocide on the title of the book, because for a number of years, the word genocide has been the focus of these issues, whereas I was more interested in discovering facts and finding out about what really happened and unearthing these facts and exposing it and digging deeper. Of course, a number of people then convinced me that if you were writing about the Armenian Genocide, people will have a hard time finding your book if the word genocide didn't appear. Particularly the publishers were interested in making sure the term was there. So in the end, I agreed. But again, the focus of the book is not to convince the readership that these acts amount to genocide. There's one chapter that deals with it for the uneducated reader. But for the rest of the chapters, we're moving beyond trying to convince the readers that these were acts of genocide. A lot has been written. Historians, political scientists, a lot of people have written tons of books about it. And this is not the purpose of this book. This book looks like the genocide and answers a few questions. For example, and I'll talk about it later, we have a chapter dedicated to Armenian American literature and how Armenian artists, authors, and poets arrived in the United States after the genocide, and how they produced their writing and how the genocide impacted them, and how they were depicting historic Armenia, or how they were trying to blend in and integrate in the United States. And there was a bit of a struggle there, trying to preserve the identity while integrating. So that's one of the chapters that is really interesting from the perspective of what is the impact. Other chapters deal with the relevance of the genocide in comparing and trying to learn lessons. The very first chapter deals with paramilitary activities during the Armenian Genocide, drawing comparisons with modern-day conflicts. So for example, during the Armenian Genocide, there was a unit called the Special Organization, which was under the control of the Ministry of Justice. And this organization was a paramilitary unit which was created to go from town to town and ignite the fire in those towns to ensure that the policies of the central authorities were implemented in the more remote localities. And why would they do that, do you think? Well, typically when an order is issued to deport or expel civilian populations, the local forces, whether they be police or army, know the local inhabitants, particularly the Armenians, the Assyrians, the Greeks. And in that time, they had a hard time implementing these orders or decrees of the central authorities. So units like the paramilitary unit, the special organization, would go from town to town to make sure that this would happen. And they would create the conditions, the fear, and initiate perhaps some criminal acts of atrocities to make sure that the plan was implemented. So that chapter deals more with comparing the special organization to modern day paramilitary groups we know of. For example, in the Balkan Wars in the early 90s, there was Arkansman, who was a famous criminal, notorious criminal, who created his own unit and, of course, had its own links to the central authorities in Belgrade. And that first chapter explains to us how governments use paramilitary units and why they discard them at the end of the war once they have used them. So those are the two angles, the general themes. Why is it still relevant, and how has it impacted several disciplines? So I mentioned to you a moment ago that we had to ensure that, at least from my perspective as a trial attorney, that we're individualizing criminal responsibility. A lot of the books that I had seen in the past relating to the Armenian Genocide used terms such as the Turks, for example. And I wanted to make sure that none of that was in this book, because we are trying to work towards individualizing responsibility. That means we want to specify who we're talking about and not limit ourselves to broad strokes. There are examples of, and this is natural, as in every conflict, of individuals who posed acts of altruism and protected minority groups. There are Turkish Schindlers, of course. That's no surprise. So that's, again, the focus was to ensure that we're getting to the bottom of the facts and ensuring that we're not, again, limiting ourselves to old ways. I'll skip this slide. Personal interest, before getting into the book, why am I interested by the issue? Obviously, there's my last name. I've always been interested by the issue, and I wanted to explore it based on my professional training and see how I can myself contribute, if I can, to the issue of the Armenian Genocide. It's an issue that's still around, and we still talk about it because of, there is a denialist approach out there, and I was curious to find out why. There was a problem, my last name. Is that a problem or not? And I discussed this a lot with several scholars as to whether there would be a perception of bias immediately because you have an Armenian last name. And very quickly, one of the famous professors in France, Claire Mouradian, she's Armenian French, she quickly brought me back to my senses and told me, well, look, if the French can write about their own history, why shouldn't the Armenians be able to do that? That kind of comforted me in a way, but I still felt that I had to be extremely careful in ensuring that the content of the book, again, met academic standards. And another thing that really made it clear to me that we had to do something for the centennial in 2015 was that in 2007, the famous Armenian-Turkish journalist Hrant Dink was assassinated in broad daylight in Istanbul. And what really got me thinking was this. Of course, at the time, the news, what was on the news was the protest marches by both Armenian and Turkish civilians in Istanbul in support of this man and his family, and how they were outraged that he had been killed. But what was really fascinating to me was what happened afterwards, the investigation, and how it was botched up, and how it was reminiscent of policies of 1915. And a lot of people were asking, well, is this a continuation of that mentality of persecution towards minority groups? Nowadays, of course, the Kurdish minority group is being heavily persecuted in Turkey. So it's a question of, is this the same mentality or not? So again, we were curious to dig deeper in that. So I wanted to talk to you, for those of you who are not familiar, and I don't know if I will be wasting your time or not, but very briefly to talk about what is the Armenian Genocide in 2 minutes so that we can get into the subject of the book. So As you know, in 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the war on Germany's side, and the territory of the empire was shrinking at that time. They were losing a lot of ground in the Balkans. As you can see in this map, the dark red portion is what was left of the Ottoman Empire in 1914, and all the light pink areas had been lost in the last century, and more recently in Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece. And what that meant was that there was an influx of Turkish refugees coming from those territories into Turkish mainland. So the Ottoman authorities had to deal with a heavy refugee problem, a very heavy one. We're talking about millions and millions of civilians flooding that area. And at the same time, of course, Turkey had entered the war, and Russia, which was right next door, was the enemy, basically. And there were Armenians fighting on both sides. But there were particularly Armenians fighting under the Russian Empire. And as the authorities got wind of this, they started looking for an internal enemy. One of the chapters that deals with anthropology talks about the concept of othering. When the self-concept of the nation is being attacked, authorities will look for an excuse. And as soon as they found out that Armenians had been fighting on the Russian side, the decision to expel and deport that population came very quickly. So again, it was part of that thinking. And just to show you very briefly here, you see the lightly orange shaded area is 6 provinces which are traditionally known at the time as the so-called Armenian provinces. They're not Armenian provinces. They're provinces where Armenians lived primarily in the Ottoman Empire. And those are the regions which were heavily affected by the deportation and the expulsion. And this is a map that shows you the deportation routes. Now, a lot of Armenians were, of course, deported towards the area of Deir Zor, which is the desert now in Syria. But a lot of them were also held in detention camps, and massacres were happening as of April 1915. Why do I say April 1915? The 24th of April is the symbolic date of the beginning or the commencement of the deportation policies. And that night, on the night of April 24th, about 200 to 300 Armenian intellectuals and members of the Armenian leadership were arrested and transferred to detention camps. What's interesting about this event is that when you hear that story of April 24th, traditionally you hear about, they arrested 200 to 300 intellectuals, they executed them, and that was the end of it. But that was not quite the story. And what I found out by reading the memoirs of one of the survivors of that operation, Father Balakian, he was a priest, a number of the people who were arrested that night were actually released. And what was interesting about that is that they had a connection with the central authorities, the ministers, primarily the Minister of Interior and the Minister of War. And that showed to me that those individuals had the power to release or arrest whoever they wished to within the Armenian community. And it showed how deep the control of the central authorities reached. So that part of the story was quite interesting in kind of clarifying the situation. And finally, the main perpetrators, these are the ones who are traditionally known as the main architects of the Armenian Genocide. In the middle, you have Talat Pasha, who is the Minister of Interior. You have Enver Pasha and Cemal Pasha, who are also the Minister of War and also Mayor of Istanbul. So those three were known as the main perpetrators. But of course, on the ground, they had their governors who were implementing the policies. And just an interesting story, they were tried after the war in absentia by courts in Istanbul. And this is something that is missing from the historiography of the Armenian Genocide, and has been coming to the surface in the last 10 to 15 years. Records of these trials were found in Istanbul in the Ottoman archives. So we very often talk about the Leipzig trials in Germany after the First World War as one of those trials that took place for the first time in trying to prosecute, investigate war criminals. But in Istanbul, several trials were held. People were sentenced, and people were actually hanged. The death penalty was in place at the time. So there were prosecutions, there were investigations. Unfortunately, the legacy of these trials were muffled quickly as of 1923, when Turkish Republic was developing and nationalism took over, and those trials were quickly forgotten. And this is one of those moments where you think, well, what a shame, because we talk about Nuremberg and the trials and the impact that it had in post-war Germany. Those trials could have had that same impact, but unfortunately, they did not. They were completely lost for decades. I think it's only in the late 80s or early 90s that these judgments were unearthed and people started to talk about them. So let's get back to the book. This was just to give you a bit of an idea of what the Armenian Genocide was about and how it came to be. So I spoke to you about the relevance, the impact. Those are the themes, and the other aspect was the interdisciplinary aspect. Now, to me, what was most enriching was to exchange with scholars from other disciplines. The legal aspects of the genocide I was very much familiar with. I knew it pretty well, although you can always discover more. But what was really fascinating was to find commonalities between scholars from other fields of study. And in the book, what we made sure of was that we're not putting in 20 different chapters. These are not 20 different essays, just put one after the other. We ensured that there was a form of dialogue, a lot of cross-referencing between the chapters to show that one item in literature can also be very relevant in the legal chapters of the book. So that was one aspect that was really important for me in ensuring that this was not just a legal project. So this is the outline. You have 5 main segments loosely put together, starting with history, followed by law, political science, including mainly denial. And then the last 2 segments deal with memory and modern. It's really focusing with the modern aspects of memory and culture. And the last 4 chapters deal with literature, education, and media studies. So that's the main theme of the book. Now, if I could briefly zoom through the various chapters, and I will focus as much as I can on the legal aspects of the book. Okay? So the foreword was written by Ronald Suni. He's a very well-known scholar of Russian and Eastern European and Armenian history. And he gave the keynote speech at a conference we organized last year in March. And it was really good to have his support and his perspective. I think that bringing him to The Hague last year, it's the city of international justice, and we have a lot of colleagues who work day in, day out in those international tribunals. It was nice for them to hear from a historian as to how decisions were made during the Armenian Genocide and how they could, again, see those parallels and have a very compact but a brief presentation on the history. So he opens the book, and then we have the first chapter I was talking to you about on the paramilitary units. Ümit Ungor is a professor at University of Amsterdam, and he deals with that topic, and he's actually running researches now. He has a grant to run further researches on paramilitary activities. The second chapter was written by a demographer who used to work at the ICTY, and there's a big war on the numbers, the death toll during the genocide. And what he does in his chapter is using state-of-the-art modern procedures and methodologies to reach as accurate as possible to numbers when we were trying to deal with, at least at the ICTY, with the impact of deportation policies, and showing to at least the court that, well, before the war you had 500,000 people living in this area. After the war you have 250,000, mainly of one ethnic group. So the judges are able to reach their own conclusion. With respect to the Armenian Genocide, it was very complicated. He agreed to take on the task and in looking into what was available. And what was available was some basic, there was data. There was a census in 1913 of the population. And that census gave very basic numbers, but enough for him to work with and reach some conclusions about the validity and the reliability of studies done after the genocide and assessing the number of victims. Now, on the side of the Turkish government, they accept that about 300,000 Armenians perished during what they call a relocation program. Most scholars and historians, and I would say those who support the Armenian thesis, if I can call it that way, agreed to a number closer to 1.5 million. So why do we have such disparity in the assessment in numbers? So Jakub compares 5 or 6 studies done by Armenian, Turkish, and non-aligned, if I can call, scholars to evaluate how they went about it. And at the end of his chapter, he provides recommendations as to how we can get as close as possible to accurate numbers, because in his view, we're not even close. Well, there is enough out there to get to reach that number, but it would require a lot of work, and he provides formulas for that. The third chapter dealing with history was written by Lawrence Sherinian on the issue of orphans of the Armenian Genocide. He explains how orphanages were established and how a group of 100 Armenians ended up in the town of Georgetown in Ontario. He's the descendant of one of those orphans, and he exposes the issue of the orphans and how they came to grips with being uprooted from their homeland and transferred to a totally different continent and how they went about their lives. So those are the first 3 chapters dealing with the historical aspects of the genocide. Now, that doesn't mean that history isn't elsewhere in the book, but we focused them in those first 3 chapters. The next segment contains the legal chapters. There are 6 chapters dealing with the legal issues. The first chapter we decided to put was Jeffrey Robertson's The Law and the Politics, because he provides, again, to the untrained or uneducated reader a very quick synopsis on how, at least he perceives, the Armenian scenario as fitting the Genocide Convention's definition. So he begins with that, and in the second part of his chapter, he deals with the politics in the United Kingdom and how Her Majesty's government for a number of years held a position which could be said to be somewhat denialist, and how his research and his publication helped the government switching their discourse to one that is more neutral. So this chapter is very interesting from that perspective. The next chapter was written by Susan Karamanyan, who is the Vice Dean of the George Washington University Law School, and she wrote about the idea that has been circulating out there of bringing the case before the International Court of Justice. She advises against it. A lot of talk has been made about having this epic battle before the International Court of Justice, Armenia versus Turkey, like a football match, in hoping to satisfy both sides. And she compares, she looks at the jurisprudence of the ICJ dealing with genocide cases, primarily the Bosnia versus the former Republic of Yugoslavia case, and how that, in her view, the ICJ is not equipped to deal with major cases of genocide, particularly because it is not prepared to receive evidence itself. I mean, the ICJ had to borrow evidence from the ICTY in establishing some of the facts, but she also deals with other issues that are much more complicated, such as jurisdiction. Obviously, before the ICJ, both states have to agree to bring the case before the ICJ. And so she deals with all these issues of jurisdiction and the limitations of the ICJ. The following chapter was prepared by Nolwenn Guibert and Sun Kim, who were at the time both legal officers at the ICTY, and they wrote about the issue of compensation, restitution, and recognition of the Armenian Genocide, recognition being a form of satisfaction. They do a brief review of the existing jurisprudence out there. There have been many cases dealing with Armenians who have tried to launch cases and suits before courts to against insurance companies who had not basically met their obligations towards the descendants of victims of the genocide, and there were class acts also brought against those companies. She also deals with the jurisprudence. They also both deal with the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. The ECHR heard a number of cases dealing with denial and limitations on freedom of expression in Turkey, and some of these cases are very illuminating as to how modern-day Turkey is dealing with the issue of the Armenian Genocide. So that's what we have with this chapter. And the next one, written by Najwa Napti. Najwa is a appeals counsel before the ICTY. She also taught at University of Arizona for a couple of years. She's back in The Hague now. And she wrote about sexual violence during the Armenian Genocide. And what she did is looking at the evidence that was out there with respect to sexual violence and compared it to modern-day investigations and prosecution of such crimes before international courts. And she reaches the conclusion that these crimes of atrocity during the Armenian Genocide would have been investigated in similar ways as they are today before international courts, in particularly focusing with sexual violence. Now, I won't go into the details of her chapter, but what was interesting, one aspect of it that I really found interesting is that the post-war trials heard evidence of sexual violence against Armenian women and girls, including not only sexual abuse, but slavery, and so on. And what was interesting is that in those trials, that evidence was heard and was received, whereas traditionally before Ottoman courts, non-Muslims could not testify against Turkish or Muslim members of society. And it was interesting that those courts allowed to hear that evidence. I don't believe there were any judgments or any findings on the basis of sexual violence, but they were received and they were heard. The following chapter was written by me on the issue of the failure of judicial systems during armed conflicts. And what I did there was to compare the judicial system, first of all, in Germany during the Nazi era, comparing it to the judicial system in the former Yugoslavia, primarily in Bosnia, and the judicial system in the Ottoman Empire during the genocide, in trying to see if there are patterns that we can find with respect to how a judicial system is corrupted during an armed conflict, and how lawyers, judges, who work for that judicial system and who have been working in that system for a number of years are suddenly not able to properly investigate and prosecute perpetrators during an armed conflict. And what was this interesting is you find varieties of degrees of corruption during armed conflicts. In the Nazi regime, of course, you had laws that were overtly discriminatory against the Jewish population. For example, that Jews could not marry Germans in the law on the protection of the Aryan blood. And that was pretty overtly discriminatory and racist. Whereas during the armed conflict in the former Yugoslavia, you had laws and decrees which would not allow, for example, 3 Muslims or more than 3 Croats to assemble in the city. But those laws, I mean, what happened on the ground was more based on non-written rules rather than written law. But what we saw in the former Yugoslavia is a judicial system that was being more negligent in a way that they would not investigate and prosecute crimes committed against the victims of the other ethnic groups. So, for example, if you have a town that is being controlled by the Serb leadership and the victims are Muslim or Croat, crimes committed against those minorities would not be investigated, although you had very willing and prepared lawyers and prosecutors. And we've heard evidence from such prosecutors who would tell you that although we had the evidence, we had received this very strict orders to not pursue those crimes. So I found that to be very interesting. And in the case of the Ottoman Empire during the Armenian Genocide, I found similarities. So that was the chapter that dealt with that issue. And the last chapter dealt with using counterinsurgency as an excuse. Hannibal Travis teaches at Florida International, and he wrote on genocidal intent, but focusing on armed rebellion or counterinsurgency as an excuse. What he found was he started with the case of the former Yugoslavia, and he compared it to the Armenian Genocide. And in the former Yugoslavia, I mean, you will not find, particularly, for example, in Bosnia, you will not find a single municipality which is 100% ethnically pure. You always had a Serbian village next to a Croatian village next to a Muslim village. And of course, as the war was approaching, people started arming themselves. And at least in the Karadzic trial and the cases associated to the Karadzic trial, we found the defense that was developing, which was one that, well, the other side was armed. So we had to protect ourselves. So that was the excuse that was being used as a pretext to arrest, deport, or even massacre large parts of that non-Serb population. He found similar arguments in the case of the Armenians, but not only the Armenians. And one thing I wanted to say also here is when we're talking about the Armenian genocide, other victim groups were victimized as well. We talk about the Assyrians, who are also another Christian minority. The Greeks were also victimized as part of that. So that was his chapter, which was very interesting from that perspective. Now, in the last 5 minutes, I'll try to whiz through the remaining chapters. I tried to focus on the legal ones as much as possible. The following 3 chapters deal with denial. The first one was written by Levon Shorbajan, who teaches here at Loyola, and he wrote about the immediate response of the Ottoman Empire in 1915 to a declaration which was issued by the Allies holding accountable the Ottoman leadership for what they called at the time crimes against humanity. Of course, it's a term of phrase. It's not crimes against humanity as we know it since 1945, but they use that terminology and call it crimes against humanity. So this declaration was issued on the 27th of May, 1915, by France, England, the United States, and Russia. And very quickly, a week later, the Ottoman leadership issued a statement pretty much denying everything that was said in there. So he starts with that declaration and moves on to the 1920s and 30s and gives the example of a film which was produced here in the United States called The 40 Days of Musadagh. For those of you who are not familiar, Musadagh is a region of Turkey where Armenian resistance had been able to hold for a number of months before they were evacuated by the French Marines. So that story was written by an Austrian author, Franz Werfel. He wrote a novel of about 900 pages, and essentially that movie was produced by MGM, but the Turkish ambassador learned of that movie and made pressure so that the movie was never broadcast, it was never distributed in the United States until much later in the 80s where a small distribution house produced the film. But at that time, interference was very clear and they were not able to show the movie. Then we move on to a chapter written by Ezra Elmas, who's a teacher at Istanbul Bilgi University, and she wrote about media in Turkey and how they dealt with the Armenian genocide. Now, 1965 marked the 50th anniversary of the genocide, and that is when attempts were made by the Armenian community around the world to get the events of 1915 to be recognized as genocide. And it started with protests in the capital of Armenia, in Yerevan. As an immediate reaction, the Turkish press started discussing the issue as an international plot against Turkey and meddling into internal Turkish affairs. And she talks about how the media had been depicting the issue of the Armenian genocide and how the Armenian community living in Turkey was somewhat forced to deny or denounce those attempts of the Western propaganda is how it was perceived. So she starts in 1965 and moves all the way to 2015 and shows us how 50 years of reporting of the Armenian genocide varied greatly. I mean, it developed to the point where she says that in Istanbul today, there's not a day goes by without a TV show or a newspaper article talking about the issue. So now matters have changed. Although with the coup d'etat this summer, I'm sure it's not as frequent as it was in the last years. This chapter was followed by Seyhan Bayraktar's chapter. She teaches at Basel University in Switzerland, and she's a teacher of political science, and she deals with the EU-Turkey relationship and what role the recognition of the Armenian genocide played in Turkey's bid to enter the European Union. So her chapters deal, it starts with a declaration made in 1987 by the European Union that Turkey had to recognize the Armenian genocide in order to enter the European Union. Now that is not the case anymore, but it affected or impacted the relationship for a number of years. And she moves all the way up to, again, 2015. So those are 3 chapters dealing with denial and political science. And we then move into, well, we still have one more here by Aida. Aida Yarbal teaches at NYU. And she wrote about this very interesting issue of a monument which was to be erected on the border between Armenia and Turkey at the city of Kars. And this monument was going to be called the Monument of Humanity. It was meant to be an act of reconciliation. That's how it was sold at first. But through her work, Ida discovered that it had nothing to do with the Armenians. In fact, the Armenian community in Turkey was not even consulted. They were completely erased from the discourse. And it was more of it was going to be a resort, really, a resort area. And this monument was to attract tourists. And that's how she develops on the whole politics. And through her chapter, she discusses the situation, the political situation in Turkey. And this monument was erected, I think it was in 2006, and demolished 2 years later after President Erdogan, at the time Prime Minister, called it a monstrosity. So that thing was knocked off and is not standing any longer. Now, Eugene Sensenig is a teacher at Notre Dame University, and he talks to us about a project he's started with his students to go back to the area of Musadar in Turkey, based on the principle of dig where you stand. It's part of the whole concept of Thana tourism, dark tourism, going back to where acts of atrocity took place. So he brings his students there. They read, of course, the book, Franz Wilfer's book, The 40 Days of Musadar. He started first with a group of Armenian students who were known to be descendants of the resistance. And going to that region was actually quite emotional for them because, they were to discuss and exchange with local Turkish villagers. And he explains to us the result of that experiment and how he's been doing those history hikes every year since then. Now, Nanor Kebranian, she was teaching at Columbia until recently, and she's now at Queen Mary in London. She wrote about the issue of the destruction of religious buildings and schools during the Armenian Genocide. And she discusses the absence of cultural destruction in the Genocide Convention. And she discusses how, in her view, the absence of cultural destruction at the time that the Genocide Convention was drafted incorporates a form of denial of genocide. In her view, destroying churches and schools is a very important aspect of destroying the identity of a group. And the absence of cultural destruction, in her view, is a major issue which should be, I think should be in favor of amending the Genocide Convention to that extent. And she talks about initiatives in Turkey to renovate churches, Armenian churches, in recent years. Finally, we have Anthony Holslach here, who talks about cultural identity of the Armenian community in London and in the Netherlands, and how they deal with the events of 1915 and how they live today with that heritage. The last 4 chapters deal with literature. I spoke to you about Barlo Demirdjian's chapter on Armenian American authors and poets. The next chapter, Lisa Siraganyan writes about, some of you may be familiar with the filmmaker Adam Egoyan. He produced a number of movies over the years, art house type movies, and his main one was about the Armenian Genocide, was Ararat, which is a famous mountain, which is not currently in Turkey. And she talks about how artists, Armenian artists, struggle with the issue of representing the Armenian Genocide through their art. So she also discusses symbolism in his movies, focusing on the Armenian Genocide, although he doesn't. Ararat is the only movie which deals with the issue full frontally. And the last 2 chapters we have is Mariot Baronian's Missing Images. She talks about how, if you compare the Armenian Genocide to other conflicts, the genocide only has not that many pictures or images, and how modern day artists are trying to fill that gap through their art in establishing some form of images of the genocide. And finally, we have Joyce Sahuni, who wrote about teaching genocide to high school students. And she had her students. She was teaching English as a second language in Quebec. She's now in London. And basically, she gave them the graphic novel Mouse by Art Spiegelman. And once they read that novel, she had them meet genocide survivors or descendants of survivors to produce their own novel. And the results were quite astonishing, and she talks about the benefits of teaching genocide at high school. So that's the book. I whizzed through it as quickly as I could in order to give you some time for questions. I'd be happy to take any questions, but that's the content of the book in a nutshell. Thank you very much.
So I hope there are questions. Before we open it for questions, a reminder that the event is being recorded, and so you've just been put on notice that if you ask a question, you are on record and part of the recording. I have a question. Oh, well, I'm going to exercise the privilege of the moderator and ask my question first, and then the term genocide, of course, was invented long after these events occurred, right? Famously invented in just after World War II, and it's a term. And I suppose this question really probably goes to Jeffrey Robertson's chapter. Yeah. It's a term that has a very technical legal meaning, and for international prosecutors, it's very frustrating because it's actually an extremely narrow legal meaning, and as a legal matter, it's a term that doesn't always apply to any mass killing or atrocity. Yeah. But then it also has a meaning outside of the law that is in popular discourse that is much broader, and sometimes it's the tension between those two different meanings that causes difficulty. Yeah. Why is it important? Can you explain, is it important for legal reasons or for cultural reasons or for reasons of history to assign this term that didn't exist at the time to these events? Because there are other terms, atrocity, right, kill, whatever. Yeah. Why is this term important?
Okay, thanks, Alex. I mean, we had a discussion yesterday also at another university. I presented a book, and the whole question was, who decides that it is genocide? Is it the lawyer or is it the historian? Aren't historians allowed also to apply the term to past events? And why is it important today to use that term? There are both legal and non-legal reasons why the term is being used. Legal in the sense that by having the term accepted as one of genocide, legally, no, because as you say, the convention was adopted in 1948, and I mean the general consensus amongst lawyers and scholars is that it would not apply, its effects would not apply retroactively. We can describe these events as one of genocides as a symbolic recognition, but we don't necessarily need it for issues such as compensation or restitution. Susan Karamanya's chapter at the very end, she concludes that if you want to have a successful process of restitution or compensation, then the better course of action is to file a claim before Turkish courts. The records are still there. If you have your titles, you may request and file a claim. And if that is not successful before courts in Turkey, then you can escalate the issue before the European Court of Human Rights. So you don't really need the term genocide for that. Now, what Jeffrey Robertson and many other scholars and historians agree on is that we have to use the term because it is the accurate description of what took place. When you look at the events, when you look at the evidence that is available, the only conclusion that you can reach was that the intent of the perpetrators and of the architects was one of getting rid of a group in whole or in part of the Armenian community in Turkey. So it is important to use the right terms to describe them appropriately and accurately and not shy away from using it, although the term did not exist back then. So in a nutshell, yeah.
But Lemkin created the word in part based on the Armenian Genocide, and the other part was the Holocaust. It wasn't just overlooking that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, that is an important aspect as well, of course, that he was inspired by those events to develop
those two events.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
My understanding of what caused the Armenian Genocide was that Turkey had basically been humiliated through some, and I don't understand what role necessarily Gallipoli had on, I think that was it, in the conflict, but the Turks had basically, this nationalism that arose was to regain their sort of dignity, and also that the Armenians were very financially successful. Mm-hmm. They were educated, they were business people, they were prosperous, and a lot of the Turks were humiliated in the war, and to regain your sense of nationalism, this helped to perpetrate that. It was, I mean, I'm sure the paramilitary carried it out, but is that correct?
Well, in the sense, Gallipoli, first of all, happened the day after the beginning of the campaign. The campaign starts at the latest on April 24th, and Gallipoli took place on April 25th. But those were happening almost simultaneously, but I don't think that's the reason that the deportations and the relocations took place. That's not. I think there's a number of factors. It's not. We can't summarize it into one or two factors. There's so many that were there. Look, persecution of Armenians had already started in 1895 with the Hamidian massacres, where 300,000 Armenians had been killed. You had other killings in 1909. So there was, I think, what you touched on a nerve there, where you talked about the situation of Armenians within Turkish society. It did probably cause a lot of envy and a lot of how would I say, friction between members of the population. It didn't apply to every parts of the Ottoman Empire. There are some parts which were maybe more agriculturally based. Those southern parts of Turkey may have had some of those features, but it was a number of factors. The fact that they were perceived to be siding with the Russian Empire, but there was also a lot of pressure from European powers for the Ottoman Empire to protect Christian citizens living in Turkey. There was a number of agreements. And again, there was this sentiment at the time that those European powers were, again, meddling within internal affairs in Turkey. So, again, it's a number of factors. It's not just one aspect that caused the beginning of the policy.
Now, would I also, I could ask another question?
I just want to see if there are.
Smyrna 1922 has been renamed. And I really had not, I read on the Armenian Genocide, but I hadn't realized what happened when when they actually depopulated Asia Minor, Christians, Greeks, Syrians, and Armenians. And that was a real shock to me. And I don't know whether you separated the two, but my figures were 1.5 million Armenians and then 1.5 million composite Christians, and that was to create the secular state of Turkey.
Right. I mean, the period of time, we always talk about 1915, but it doesn't really end there. I mean, it carries on for a number of years. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi.
You mentioned individualizing criminal activity, how important it is not to paint with broad strokes, I guess. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. It seems to me that we could run the risk of over-individualizing to the extent that we ignore a context that people operate in. We know from a wealth of psychological research that ordinary people who aren't psychopaths, who aren't evil, will do evil things when put in a situation, or they're situated within a context that leads to, extreme atrocities. So,
Yeah.
my question for you is, when we individualize, can you say more about what that means? Is that a legal strategy? Is that an appropriate moral strategy? Where does that come from?
I think it's a bit of both, actually. It is illegal. I mean, when you're targeting, within prosecutorial work, when you're targeting an individual to raise charges and to prosecute that person, of course you have to individualize, and you have to make sure you're not just entering the field of guilt by association. You have to make sure that you have solid evidence to indict someone and try them. Now, what you're talking about is more of what happens during an armed conflict and how people are driven towards committing crimes as a group, and how in a given town, perhaps people who would never commit a crime against their neighbors all of a sudden are starting to follow the policy that is in place. And again, it is still important to individualize criminality, because you could just be grabbing a portion of the population, whereas within that population you have people who had good intentions and who were trying to do their job properly, who were trying to protect a cop who was trying to do his job properly, for example, whereas a very corrupted policeman. And we have several examples like that in the trials we've had in the former Yugoslavia. So I think it still remains very important to individualize criminality. Now, whether someone will commit a crime out of duress or because he's being influenced, all of that plays a role in determining the level of the responsibility and the mode of liability through which that person participates in the crime, whether it is as weak as aiding and abetting or as strong as direct perpetration. That's an issue that we will discuss at trial. But I think that for each individual you're targeting, from a prosecutorial perspective, of course, you have to make sure you have solid grounds and good evidence. But from a societal, from maybe more of a humanities perspective, what you're looking at, of course, is studying phenomenons. And that's something that, of course, I don't want to delve too deeply in, because my expertise and my field of knowledge is really law, if I can put it that way.
We have time for one last. Do you have a question?
I do.
Okay, one last short question.
Okay. If I heard you correctly, you said that it was only with the trials, post-war trials, held by the Allies in Istanbul, Constantinople, which permitted non-Muslims to accuse and give evidence against Ottoman, or still Ottoman Muslims in court. Now, was that true before the trials? Was it true across the board for all kinds of cases that non-Muslims could not give evidence against Muslims?
Not necessarily, because you have various levels of jurisdictions, and you had more community-based also forms of holding individuals accountable. First of all, just to be clear, the trials were not held by the Allies. They were done by the judicial system in Turkey, by the Turkish prosecutors, and they're the ones who tried and indicted and sentenced and executed those who were responsible. But I think there are other forums where victims could be heard. But I think there was a criminal procedure code which was adopted in 1878 based on the Napoleon Code and adapted in Turkey, and that, I think it is within that code that you will find that testimony against a Ottoman Muslim was not permitted when the evidence came from a non-Muslim. Now, whether it was applied systematically or whether it applied at every levels of jurisdiction, I cannot give you that answer, but that reality was there. Yeah.
Okay, if you are interested in further exploring this fascinating book, we have copies that you can take a look at on the table up here, and there are flyers that will tell you how to get a discount, a pretty significant discount, if you're interested in purchasing the book. So feel free to take a flyer. And with that, please join me in thanking Alex Demirdjian.
Thank you very much.